there are many of our people who are thinking more deeply and more broadly, looking at it as it actually is, and are beginning to see it more in the international context and the relation that it has with the African struggle, a human rights struggle, or the struggle for human rights. And as such, we can then take it into the United Nations.
And bring about the freedom of these people by any means necessary.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to African Esquire TV. I'm doing this video on behalf of We Charge Colonialism. We're an organization that seeks to raise awareness of the fact that Africans in America, we are being colonized. I have a very, very, very special guest today, someone whose work I have followed for a long time, Miss Margaret Kimberley. Miss Kimberley, could you please introduce yourself for those who may not be familiar with your work?
Sure. Hi, my name is Margaret Kimberley. I am an editor and senior columnist at Black Agenda Report. Today I'm going to be talking about my new book, Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. But if you're not already, I urge everyone to read blackagendareport.com. We publish every week on Wednesday, providing analysis from a Black left perspective.
And before we get into the book, for those who haven't gone to Black Agenda Report or are not familiar with the work, can you talk about how you came to create this website?
Sure. I founded Black Agenda Report along with Glenn Ford and the late Bruce Dixon in 2006. We had previously been at the website Black Commentator, and for a variety of reasons decided to do our own site. And at that time, it's a funny thing. The Democrats had regained control of the House, and Black people were supposed to be very happy. But we provided a critique of then as now of the Democratic Party and what makes it problematic for Black people, the fact that we're in this trap of the duopoly, where there's one party that's the white people's party, and our politics now amount to little more than trying to stop them. But inevitably, we end up selling ourselves short by not having a more independent stance. Mm-hmm. We advocate, obviously, self-determination for Black people, socialism at home and abroad, opposition to all United States interventions in other countries, and I emphasize that we're left, not Democrats. So I have learned a lot from my colleagues over the years. We have a great team. Others who are contributors include Ajamu Baraka, Danny Haifong, Ann Garrison, our poet in residence, Raymond Nat Turner, Nellie Bailey. We have interviews. We have a book forum, great book forum. Roberto Servent is responsible for bringing that to us. So if anybody among your viewers is interested in books that they should read, we have a great selection that we can provide, interviews and so on.
Yes, I encourage everyone, if you haven't gone to the Black Agenda Report, they have a lot of great articles that they put out. So a really great source of information. If you haven't already, you should definitely visit. So let's talk about this book. It's titled Prejudential.
Prejudential.
Prejudential. Black America and the Presidents. Mm-hmm. What made you want to write this book?
Well, it all began... I had written a column about Theodore Roosevelt a few years ago. I had watched one of those public television documentaries about the Roosevelts, and material like that, they're always elevating their subject matter. And I knew enough about Theodore Roosevelt to know they had left out quite a lot. He was openly racist and overt and outspoken white supremacist. And they left out a lot about him. So I wrote this column about him, and a friend and supporter of Black Agenda Report said to me, he said, "Why don't you write about all the presidents?" And after giving him some thought, I took on this project. It's big undertaking writing a book, my first effort. But it's very important, I think, and the book is 45 chapters, one for each president, essays about each one. And one of the things that's clear, if you talk about all of these men, you have to talk about America's founding as a settler colonial state, about the genocide of the indigenous people, about chattel slavery, and how difficult it is to talk truthfully about a country that has that history, because you're not going to get anything good out of that foundation. And anti-Black racism is foundational to this country, and we can see why when we look at all of them from George Washington to Donald Trump.
And, these are very controversial subjects, obviously. What has been the reaction that you've gotten from unveiling these truths about the American presidency?
Well, it's most people who are interested in presidential are, it's preaching to the choir. So most people are, they are interested in history. They are interested in Black studies and Black history. They have some knowledge of the subject. They may not be familiar with all of the material I present, but I think most people who read it are predisposed to want to know more, may be surprised with some of the information, but not surprised about the overall theme of the enduring nature of anti-Black racism in this country. So it's mostly been praised. And anybody who doesn't like it, I just would not pay attention to them.
Probably on the wrong side.
If there are any critics out there, I'm not, frankly, very concerned about.
Right. Okay, so I want to talk about something that's discussed in the book, this organization called the American Colonization Society. This is an organization that we really don't talk about too much in history.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about them and their relevancy to Black Americans?
Oh, sure. Throughout, I'd say the first 100 years of the country, colonization, that is to say, removing Black people from the country and sending them to colonies and many other places were suggested, Central America, the Caribbean, Africa. I just want to remind people that the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named for President Monroe, who was among those who advocated sending Black people away. There are people who we're told were anti-slavery, but who in fact were still very racist and saw sending Black people out of the country as a solution to a problem they had created for themselves. So, for example, John Adams, the first 12 presidents, 10 of the first 12 were slaveholders. Adams' father and son were not, but John Adams was certainly no friend to Black people. He always expressed a desire to send Black people out of the country. Andrew Jackson, Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, many of the early presidents, Madison, and Abraham Lincoln. He never gave up his dream of sending Black people away. And I had always been told that he started out advocating this, but then he saw the error of his ways and stopped saying it. Well, that's not true. Up until about a week before he was assassinated, he spoke with the Union General about coming up with a plan to send Black people out of the country. There was actually one such colony that actually came to fruition in Haiti. I was on a small island called Ile La Vache, Cal Island, off the coast of Haiti, and 400 people were sent there in 1863. So he wrote the order to establish colonization the day before he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. And he always linked the two. And there's plenty of information about this. People at the time, his contemporaries, wrote about how often he spoke of colonization. So this is, it's one of many things that is hidden from us in the retelling of history. And I realized in writing the book the degree of lying that goes on among historians and biographers who, most people, if they write about someone, it's because it's someone they like and admire and respect. So they don't want to say anything negative about them. So there is this, I'll call it a conspiracy of silence, both of overt lies and, more covert lies of omission. I think Lincoln, I believe there are more biographies of Lincoln than anyone else in American history. I believe that's the case. But people rarely reveal what I just talked about. And it means we're misinformed, even when in this country, when you think you're informed and you watch the right documentaries and read the right people and presidential historians and so on, you're still misinformed because they just leave things out. And this is not top secret information. I didn't have access to secret archives. This is information you can find quite easily if you do even a cursory amount of research on any of these presidents.
Right. I mean, something I thought that the book did really well is just show how fundamental racism is to America. And one great example of that is how DC was chosen as the nation's capital. Can you explain for those who don't know the history of why DC was selected in relation to slavery?
Sure. It's interesting that they built a new city. There were already cities in the country. Why would you, near population centers located on the coast, why would you feel the need to build an entirely new capital? And we're told there was an agreement, and it is true that Alexander Hamilton hammered out this agreement that the new government would pay for the state's war debts, and that part of this agreement was that New York would be the money capital, and there would be another political capital of the country. But it still doesn't answer the question of why you had to build a new state. And the answer, quite frankly, is that they wanted a capital that was safely within the boundaries of those places that depended on the plantation economy. And I hasten to add, slavery was legal in the northern states at that time, but it was more important, played a bigger role in politics in the South. So they built a new city from scratch, wedged between Maryland and Virginia. It is said, it's not something I looked into in particular, that Washington personally profited from having a capital near his plantation, Mount Vernon. But I'll tell you one thing that explains why they felt the need to do this. Washington was inaugurated in New York City. That was the first capital. Then it moved further south to Philadelphia. And Pennsylvania had a law which said that any enslaved person who stayed in the state for 6 months would be free. So this presented a problem for Washington. He didn't want to free any of the people he had enslaved, so he just rotated them. So he didn't allow anyone to stay more than 6 months. He sent them back to Mount Vernon and brought new people up. So this tells you why this was such a difficulty in having a capital north of the Mason-Dixon line. And he was actually in violating Pennsylvania's law because they knew that people would do that. So there was an addendum to this legislation forbidding what Washington did, of taking people out of the state for the purpose of keeping them from being free. So Washington was a slaveholder. He broke the law to make sure he would have no problem holding on to the people. He and his wife, most of them were actually owned by his wife. She inherited from her first husband, but several hundred people owned by the Washingtons. And that is why they had to establish a capital where they did.
And you also talk about how a number of states, their formation was directly tied to slavery. Can you give some examples of that?
All of the states. Do you mean, I'm not sure of your question.
I'm sorry, yes, all of the states.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the colonists wanted to be free of England. There's debate about to what degree this encouraged them to want to be free of England, but it's pretty clear they did not want any. They wanted to be free to do what they wanted, to conquer the whole continent. They did not want any possibility that slavery would be made illegal or restricted in any way. The British did not want the colonies to expand any further west. They wanted the whole thing. And so they, far from being lovers of liberty and all of that, they wanted to have a nation, an independent nation, so they could have this settler state under their control only, and that they could conquer as much as they want and be unimpeded in having a slave-based economy.
So we were talking about Lincoln earlier. Obviously, he's known as the president that got the country through the Civil War. I've heard, when I was younger, that slavery was not the big reason why the Civil War occurred. However, I'd say that I didn't know how insignificant slavery actually was to the reason for the war. So can you explain why was the war fought, and why is it that Lincoln eventually did free the slaves towards the end of the Civil War?
Well, slavery did play a large role. I think what's untrue is that all Northerners were abolitionists. That is not true. There were people who did not want slavery in their states because they did not want Black people in them. So their opposition to slavery was in fact racist. The existence of slavery also disadvantaged many white people, white working people, small farmers. They could not compete with the great wealth of these big plantation owners. So they wanted to have free soil states where there was no slavery. The South and those people who did think slavery wrong were constantly under pressure to accommodate the South. So there were various things tried. There would be slavery only up to a certain latitude and no further north. That if a slave state entered the Union, a free state had to enter the Union. There was something called a gag rule where basically any discussion of slavery in Congress was tabled and was not allowed to be discussed. There were efforts to get the slave trade out of the District of Columbia. So all of these things did play a part in creating the war. The Republican Party was a new party, which Lincoln was a member of. Their goal was to stop the spread of slavery into the new territories. Some of them were abolitionists. They were called radical abolitionists. Others were like Lincoln. But the South gambled and lost when they, lest we forget, are the ones who started the war, when they attacked the federal garrison at Fort Sumter outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And they thought it would be short. They thought that they would win. They thought they would win quickly. And so they took this opportunity. But slavery did definitely play a part. But I think we should also realize there are a couple of things. Lincoln was most interested in preserving the Union. He famously said, I want, if I can keep the Union with slavery, I will. If I can keep the Union without slavery, then I will do that. But it's the enslaved themselves who forced the issue. Every time Union troops appeared, and the enslaved people ran away to the Union lines for protection. And while there was always debate about whether this was a war about slavery, they're the ones who answered the question that yes, it was. And at first, Lincoln, and the people who managed to escape were sent back to their slaveholders. But there was a Union general, Butler, who was the first to say that, first of all, these people could be a labor force for the war, and they were started to be kept as quote unquote contraband. And as the war ground on, Lincoln and others realized that the formerly enslaved and freed people who wanted to fight for the Union could be an important part of their military strategy. So all of these things turn the war into a war against slavery. I also want to go back a couple of years before 1859, John Brown. I was always taught there was a raid on Harper's Ferry. I didn't know what this raid was. He, a true abolitionist, a man quite committed to ending slavery, hoped to start a slave insurrection. And while he was defeated and he was captured and hanged, he ended up winning the day. I think he hastened the beginning of the Civil War, which is a good thing. There's to me, no debate about it. Slavery would never have ended without the military defeat of the Confederacy. So the Civil War was a good thing. I think it's funny when it's these pro-Confederate white supremacist types want to celebrate the start of the Civil War and Black people get upset. We should be the ones to celebrate the start of the Civil War and explain our role in freeing ourselves and our role in defeating the slave owners.
It definitely reminds me of something I say a lot on this channel, and that is that the dominant society, when it comes to doing something for Black people, it has to be in the society's interest. And so, as you pointed out, in that instance, it was in the society's interest that slavery be abolished so that the Civil War could be won. So I thought that was it's an important thing for people to understand, especially talking about voting. And a lot of people don't see it in their interest to do things for African Americans. So I think that was a good instance of that happening.
Yes.
Yes. So Andrew Jackson is another president you talk about. And it's interesting. Before Trump, I think most people would have called him the most racist president because, there's just so much in the history books that's unfavorable to him. However, most of it that I've read is in regard to Indigenous Americans. However, he also, his presidency also played a part, obviously, with African Americans. Could you speak on how the Jackson presidency affected us?
Yeah, people have asked me who I would say is the worst, and I would say Jackson. He is the one who made real the expulsion of indigenous people from the Southeast, so-called civilized tribe, the Cherokees, Seminole. I'm blanking on the other three: Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek. Aha! I remembered from the southern states to hasten the establishment of the plantation economy there. The Indian Removal Act. The Supreme Court actually had sided with the Cherokees, and Jackson just ignored it. He said, well, the Chief Justice made his decision, let's see if he can enforce it. And forced people out via what we all know is the Trail of Tears, sending indigenous people to Oklahoma. And the purpose of doing this was to make sure that there was no impediment to slavery really taking hold in the southern part of the country. So here's a man who made real 2 genocides. Something else that is not talked about very well, other European countries still had a presence on the continent. Florida belonged to Spain. The British still had a presence in the South, the Spanish and the French. And he defeated all of them. He attacked Florida, which was in effect attacking Spain. He was allowed to get away with it. He hung 2 Englishmen. He did all kinds of things. And people pretended to investigate and pretended to look into it. but ultimately he was supported. And even those presidents who were not slaveholding went along with all of this. He was a slaveholder himself. He owned a couple hundred people. Um, I remember watching a documentary once that there's some indigenous people who don't want a $20 bill because his face is on it. So they'd rather have a 10 or a 50, but they don't want a 20 because they don't even want to see his face. So he was a terrible man, genocidaire, and we should think of these people that way. They were, the Hitlers of this country. And they did the same thing. They created mass death. They invaded someone else's land with aggressive intent. They enslaved other people. So he is, in my opinion, the worst. Steve Bannon, who was shaping, Trump's strategy, turned him. I'm sure Donald Trump didn't know much about Andrew Jackson. He doesn't know very much about anything, but he's the one who, turned Jackson into Trump's favorite president. And of course it fits. But there were many racist presidents, many. And Trump is not the first one to use racism as a political tool either. And that's the other thing. I don't want people to think that Trump is some sort of aberration, because he's not.
So there's been a lot of push recently to get Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And what is your response to that? Obviously, Harriet Tubman was a freedom fighter, one of the greatest in my opinion. And a lot of people want to see a Black woman on money. What is your thoughts on that? What do you think that does for us, if anything?
Yeah, I don't see it as honoring her. I mean, a few years ago, it was towards the end of the Obama presidency, there was this push to get women on the money along with men, almost all of whom are presidents. And I don't believe Harriet Tubman is honored by putting her on money. She suffered because of money. Slavery existed because of money. I don't believe she's being honored by putting her face on the cause of her suffering and what it was that she fought against. And it's interesting. At first, the talk was of her being on the 20 instead of Jackson, but someone in the Obama administration said, no, they would share the $20 bill, which to me was even more insulting, to have her share this supposed honor with this man whose entire career was devoted to stealing as much of the country as possible, pushing other Europeans out so he could establish a slaveholding empire. So it doesn't bother me that they don't want Harriet Tubman's face on the money. Let's honor her some other way. I don't think I do not believe it's a fitting honor for her.
So one more president from the past, and then we're going to more modern presidents. Harry Truman, who was, you call the Klansman president. For those who are unaware of him and his racist ideology, could you give some background on him?
Sure. Harry Truman was from Missouri, which was a slaveholding state. It was one of those states that did not join the Confederacy, although there were guerrillas like the James Gang, Jesse and Frank James, the Quantrill's Raiders, and so forth. Truman's grandparents were all slaveholders. He, in the 1920s, when the Klan was quite popular, he joined the Klan, and when it was revealed years later, he made up some story about he didn't really want to do it. He was forced. Somebody threatened. His life was threatened unless he joined the Klan. It's like, come on, dude, really? But he was a segregationist. He does have this reputation for being one of the good for Black people presidents. But in 1948, he was expected to lose. He came to office when Franklin Roosevelt died. And he was seen as just a caretaker who would lose in the 1948 election. But one of his strategists told him that if he could harness the Black vote in the North, that's the only place where Black people could vote, that he might be able to win. So as a result of that, he desegregated the military. There was an effort. The late Strom Thurmond bolted from. Now the Democrats, by the way, were the party of the segregated South, lest we forget. Strom Thurmond bolted from the Democratic Party, started they were called the Dixiecrats, who ran an independent campaign against him, and that forced his hand even more. He did come up with some civil rights legislation. It was something pretty tepid, having to do with companies that received federal money. And he did eke out that victory. He came to Harlem a few days before Election Day in 1948, had a huge rally here. Thousands of people attended. And he did manage to win. You may be familiar with the famous photo of him holding up a newspaper that says Dewey wins, but in fact, he was the one who won. But what he did was to solidify his victory when he was confronted by Paul Robeson and a group, the Anti-Lynching Society. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the actual name of the organization, but he confronted Truman about lynching, and Truman was very offended and left the meeting because Robeson, being Robeson, didn't back down. And of course, they punished him by taking his passport and being blacklisted and so forth. But so when it came to actually defending Black people and this anti-lynching crusade, which had been going on for decades, there was no president. None of them stepped up and passed any anti-lynching legislation. This law they passed a couple of weeks ago is a joke. Right now, the lynch mob are the police. I mean, those are the lynchers now, and there's no federal action to stop the carnage that they produce every day.
Yeah, it seems, talking about the recent legislation, anything that happens as far as Black people, it seems to be symbolic, and not actually going towards our actual situation that we're dealing with at the time.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. It's at the same time they passed this blue protection law or something, making it a federal crime to assault a cop or the people who are the lynchers of the 21st century. But yes, it is symbolic, and none of them took on that issue. They would all say, Franklin Roosevelt said, Truman said, they would all use the South as their excuse. Democrats would. I would do more, but I can't. I need those votes. I need that support. And later in life, in the late 50s, early 60s, when the first sit-ins at lunch counters and so forth, the efforts to desegregate began, Truman was very public. He said Negroes should behave themselves, and if somebody did that in my business, I'd throw them out. So he was an old segregationist till the end.
Right. So that relates to today, I think, as you said, no matter what, Black people were always told by presidents that, we would get to you, but we have to appease all these other voters. So going to modern history, we have Bill Clinton, who I remember as a kid hearing that he was the first Black president. And Toni Morrison, you talk about, is the one who kind of started that idea of him being the first Black president. So what are your thoughts on him and his relation to Black America?
Well, it's funny to hear that now. I think at the time nobody thought there ever would be a Black president. So it was metaphorical. I think she was saying he was, he came from a humble background, working class family. He was hated by Republicans, but he was no friend of ours. When he first ran in 1992, he did several things to distance himself from Black people, but still got our votes. While he was campaigning, he left the campaign trail to sign an execution document in his home state of Arkansas. A man who was mentally disabled and unable to defend himself, who should never have been sentenced to death, but Clinton had the man executed. he also, excuse me, there was the Sister Souljah moment. This was after the riots in Los Angeles, after the cops were acquitted of beating Rodney King. And the rapper Sister Souljah made some comment about if it's okay for Black people to kill each other, why isn't it okay for Black people to kill white people? It was a rhetorical issue, statement that she made about the way crime is perceived. But Clinton attacked her in the presence of Jesse Jackson. And so the message was not subtle. He was telling white people that he would stand up to Black people and nobody should worry that he was going to listen to us or do anything we might want him to do. The most disgraceful thing he ever did, he had a photo opportunity at a prison in Georgia, near Stone Mountain, Georgia. And they lined up these prisoners, almost all Black men in prison uniforms. And he gave this speech about how he was tough on crime. And Stone Mountain, Georgia there is a mountain, a stone mountain, and there is a sculpture, a relief actually, of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson carved into this mountain. And this is the home of the 20th century Klan also. So it was a disgraceful thing that he was allowed to do. But by that time, Democrats were the Black People's Party, and it was the Republicans. They switched in the late 60s. The Republicans became the White People's Party, and we were counseled to back any Democrat for any reason, no matter what they did. And then when he became president, welfare, so-called reform, which pushed millions of people into poverty. He's the one who started added to the mass incarceration with the crack cocaine laws. So he was terrible. The things he did were awful. But we have, because we're trapped in this duopoly and we're trapped in this situation where we don't want to support the Republicans, we have been convinced that that means never speaking up to the Democrats. And that is not what it should mean. We should be able to practice self-determination. We should be actors and not be so passive and sit back and wait for some Democrat to get the presidential nomination and then fall into line. We need to, as a people, state our case, draw a line, say you cannot step over this line in order to get our support. And you could still have Democratic victories. We've also been convinced that that doing that being anything less than a passive observer would mean a Republican victory.
Right.
So his term was very damaging to Black people. And I think we're seeing a replay of that if the Democratic Party establishment succeeds in pushing Joe Biden through, who I don't think would win against Trump. But if he would become president, I think we'd see a replay of those Clinton years.
Well, of course, Biden was Obama's vice president, which I think is really getting him any play as far as Black America.
It doesn't hurt him. That's for sure. It doesn't hurt him. And the Democrats have succeeded in planting a doubt in Black people's minds that Bernie Sanders, the other front runner, would win. And they know that Black voters are risk averse. And our politics, and this is the problem with not asserting our own interest, not asserting self-determination. We have shrunk our politics down to keeping Republicans out. Always. That's it. That's the only thing we can do. So if you tell Black voters Bernie Sanders can't win, white people aren't going to vote for him, even though people want the things he's talking about, they will not support that person if there's any doubt that they can win the presidential election. Yeah. So we're seeing a replay of that kind of thing now. It's
an interesting thing about that dynamic is it's kind of slavery in a sense that Black people, we are kind of the ones in the Democratic Party who have agreed to put the interest of the party before our own, and everyone else can have their interest addressed.
Mhm.
But for us, we basically have to do whatever is going to be best for the party. And we're essentially still being slaves, in my opinion, to that establishment.
Yeah, it's being subservient, and it also leads to corruption amongst our own people. At Black Agenda Report, we talk a lot about the Black misleadership class and these elected officials and others who are joined at the hip with the Democratic Party, and they get enough for themselves in order to be these mouthpieces for the Democrats. And so they are very self-interested for one thing, and they advocate things that are disastrous for the rest of us. So for now, we're seeing the current Black misleader in the news is Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina. He endorsed Biden, and we're being told that helped Biden in the recent primaries. I don't think it hurt him in that state of South Carolina. But what do we see Clyburn do? Advocate that we don't need any more primaries. We don't need any more debates. Let's just go straight to the convention and nominate this man. So to hell with people who haven't voted yet. And for example, here in New York State, our primary is until next month. There are millions of people who haven't had a say, who haven't had the chance to vote. But that's pretty typical of how people like him behave. And they do all kinds of horrible things. They lie. I'm not even a Democrat anymore, by the way. I'm a member of the Green Party. But, for example, Bernie Sanders said accurately the Democratic Party establishment does not want him. So they have now said that, well, he's saying that Black voters are the establishment, which is a lie. It's propaganda.
Right. It didn't make sense.
It's the kind of thing they do. And now they're saying he's disrespecting Black voters. So it's just one more reason to get Biden, a man who has some sort of cognitive problem, who is very right-wing, who has said as many racist things as Trump has said. And we're told that he's the way to get rid of Trump, and he's the only way to get rid of Trump, and we have to be behind him. So these misleaders, some of them, were endorsing when Mike Bloomberg, former billionaire, former mayor of New York City, good thing is the scoundrels expose themselves. That's the way I look at it. But Bloomberg wasn't in it to become president anyway. His goal is to control the Democratic Party and make sure it doesn't do anything that people need. And to make sure that there's no progressive legislation. There is not even a tiny little bit of leftward movement. And so the people who endorsed him signed on to that. And that's quite sad.
Going back to Obama, I going through the presidency, I always felt like I've never seen Black people more crippled as far as pushing for something that was actually good for us. And you call them in the book the wolf and Fubu. What is your analysis of his presidency and Black people's unwillingness to fight for themselves during it?
Yeah, I say the best thing Black people got out of Obama is that they were happy. And I'm not opposed to people being happy, but it's a very dangerous thing to be that happy and to love a politician that way. We have an adversarial relationship with electoral politics. These people they're not our friends. These are people who, in the best of time, if we mobilize, we can push them to get some of the things we need. But they aren't anybody that should be elevated and worshipped. But the degree of pride in seeing him win, the fact that a lot of the opposition to him was, in fact, so racist, kept people from critiquing him, from questioning him. And so we went along with anything he did. So he bailed out the banks. The 2008 financial crisis caused by the banks, he bails them out. And did he bail out the Black people who lost their homes? Nope. but no one said anything about that. In foreign policy, he destroyed Libya. He and Hillary Clinton, his ghoulish Secretary of State. And if nobody defended or supported Muammar Gaddafi, Black people did. But because it was Obama who had him killed, there was silence. And this belief that we had to support him no matter what. So it was the same syndrome of always defending a Democrat, except this time it was a Black Democrat. And there was so much hope placed on him, and still so much reverence. And it's kind of, frankly, to me, it's crazy. People say, go on and on. Oh, I miss him. Oh, that's how it works. Nobody's president forever. And it's a cult of personality, I believe. So, but he did what the rest of them did, and we could see it from the beginning if we were paying attention. He, when he ran in 2008, against John McCain, he raised 10 times as much money. McCain raised a measly $50 million. Obama raised $500 million. What does that tell you? Whose interest was he going to support? Who put him in office? It's the same group of people. They needed a change. The Republicans were, George W. Bush left office unpopular. The Republicans were not the party who were going to help the ruling classes. They needed a new face. They needed better marketing. Who better than a Black man who said he was going to bring about change?
So in closing, obviously, all these presidencies kind of can paint a bleak picture of electoral politics if you think about it. So for voters who are looking at what's going on right now, it looks like Bernie Sanders is more than likely not going to win. And a lot of us, that was who we might have been voting for. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are saying Bernie or bust. They're not going to vote if for Biden, even if it's Biden against Trump. What alternatives do you recommend for Black radical voters? I know you said you're part of the Green Party. What should we be doing to organize so that we could potentially have a voice in the next big election?
Well, first of all, anybody who supports Bernie Sanders should still be supporting him. And when James Clyburn or James Carville or anybody says, well, no more debates, let's just go straight to the convention, you have to say no. And even if he can turn things around and get to the convention with more delegates, they've already said, well, you don't have to get the nomination because you get the most votes. They're already planning to steal it from him. So people need to protest very loudly and not be afraid to break from the Democratic Party. This break is a necessity. Having Democrats like Joe Biden in the White House, what do we get having him as president? I mean, he would hire, he would have Black people in his cabinet that we like. It wouldn't be somebody crazy like Ben Carson. And, you'd get better federal appointees and federal judiciary. But this foreign policy would be the same. Domestic policy would be the same. Biden, in a speech to some fat cat fundraisers, told him, he says, well, nothing's really going to change if I win. So he already told you. And this idea that the best we can do is to not have a bigot like Trump, that's your only expectation, that's the only thing you should want, and you should be satisfied with that, is really awful. And it leads us over the cliff. We're always the loser. Even if we win, quote unquote, with the Democrat, we're still the losers if we have to support someone like Biden. I hope there is a break in the Democratic Party. Nobody should vote for Biden because, well, it's Trump. They don't let him scare you with Trump, who's horrible in many ways, but Biden is horrible in many ways. We've got to stop saying that we have to accept these crumbs. And if people don't want to vote for a Democrat, then they should not. And we need a real left party, a real peace party, a real people's party, a real workers' party. And I'm hoping that people come over to the Greens, or at very least leave the Democrats. There's nothing to be afraid of. And this generational break is interesting to me, but I see that young people your age, are having an entirely different experience. People my age, we were able to go to college without ending up $1 jillion in debt. We knew we could get living wage jobs with benefits, and young people have none of those assurances. And I hope that young people continue to speak up and not do what their elders do. So let the chips fall where they may. I think sometimes breakups are always hard, but sometimes they're necessary. But no one should support Joe Biden if they don't want to. And they will find a way to do Bernie Sanders in, and those people who support him must protest very, very loudly. And if that leads to a break in the party, so be it.
Absolutely. So I think we'll end it there. Again, the book is called Prejudice. So I don't know why I have such a hard time saying it.
Yeah, I'm putting it up here. It's a presidential prejudicial. I'll put it right by my head. The publishers thought of that. Prejudice.
No, I love it. I just can't have a difficulty pronouncing it.
Okay, that's okay.
Oh, where can it be found? On Amazon?
It's on Amazon. You can buy it online. Also from the Steerforth, published by Steerforth Press, steerforthpress.com. Also on Amazon. It's paperback and ebook and an audiobook narrated by yours truly. And it's also in bookstores. It's in some Barnes and Nobles. So people should, your local bookstore may have it. And you can always ask them to order it. And I'm happy to, I've gone to readings, mostly here on the East Coast because it's easier, but I was in Detroit last weekend. So I'm very, very happy to promote the book. And my email and contact information is on Black Agenda Report. After my column, I'm also on Twitter, Freedom Ride blog. So people can get in touch with me if you want me to promote the book. I'm very happy to do so.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kimberley. And everyone, I will see you in the next video.
Thank you.